Thanks very much, Heather. Morning, everyone. Very nice to see you here on this morning. I'm not going to look outside because it is quite miserable. Unfortunately, it's not sunny, but hopefully we'll have a sunny session anyway. You probably all, or practically all of you know that I'm Anne Cojeen and I'm a partner in the real estate transactional team at Hempsons. I'll let Rachel introduce herself as well.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Rachel. I think I know just about everybody, and I am a partner in property litigation, and I head up the team, and I work closely with Anne.
Thanks very much, Rachel. The idea behind the session this morning really is to talk about achieving value for money. I would say it's not always about the money. So there will be a session where we'll be looking at particular aspects of trying to make sure that you are on track really to be able to demonstrate, certainly for audit purposes, that you have been testing and you're able to try and demonstrate that you are achieving value for money in property matters or real estate matters, if you want to call them real estate. So if I just give you an overview first off of what we're going to be talking about. Everyone practically should know about the estate code and the fact that its technical name is HBN 0008. The estate code for NHS trusts is all about best practice. And I have been asked many times, well, what happens if we can't quite follow the estate code? And I always say, well, it is supposed to be best practice, but we can't always just look at one thing in isolation. And I think it's really important to hold that thought and run with it. When Rachel and I were talking about the idea for the topic this morning, I mentioned about value for money. And I've always known, ever since I started working for the NHS many years ago, that value for money is one of those key principles in the estate code. So I thought I'd dust off the estate code and have a look and do a little word search and see how many times value for money did appear. Whilst I was doing that, I came across the section that I've got on the slide, which is specifically in relation to paragraph 2.18, and it's talking about commissioner requirements and expectations, actually. So NHS England and the ICBs in particular, but also local authorities when they commission services. And what I've tried to do is colour code the section, looking at some of the points which talk about money in particular, but also picking up some other themes. And also in bold, we've got the reference to value for money. But I think it's worthwhile me just reading that out because it does help set the parameters, I think, for the discussion we're going to have. So one of the commissioner requirements, it's quite wordy, talks about enabling the estate to operate flexibly, economically and efficiently, providing and maintaining appropriate and affordable healthcare facilities that are fit for purpose, value for money, they complement statutory requirements and support the provision of good quality clinical care. That's quite a lot, really. There's no one person, there's no one professional that could cover all of these facets, really. So what Rachel and I will be looking at in particular are different members of the professional team and how they can help in securing value for money. So we will be looking at the role that the agent plays, and obviously the solicitor and the surveyor. And there are other professionals as well, but those are key ones which we've come across very recently because we've got some lived examples that we'd like to talk about as well, because we always find that it's more helpful when you've got those kind of lived examples to have a think about. So we're going to focus on looking at the deal itself. And part of that, not all of it, but part of that is getting to the point where we actually have agreed heads of terms. we're also going to have a look at the situation where works might need to be done to a property. That's particularly in relation to where you're leasing premises. And then we're going to have a look at dilapidations as well. So through each of these threads, we're going to be having a look at how you can secure value for money. Before we look at the different professionals, though, I thought it would be helpful. I mentioned earlier that I'd done a little word search in the estate code to have a look at value for money and how many times it features. There are various references in different paragraphs to the phrase, which just shows how important it is treated really for NHS trusts. And the bits in green, excuse me, they are all mentioned in the context of paragraphs that refer to achieving value for money. We've also got the other areas that are in the kind of darker colour as well. They're also referred to in the same way. So I think some of the key ones that ping out to me really are commercial terms. It's a particular key one, and so we can have a think about who actually we would go to try and get commercial terms for us. Looking at a business case, this always starts with a business case. Any transactional matter certainly does anyway. Looking at a business case, making sure that you've done an option appraisal, so that you're looking at the best way forward, and also ensuring that any decision making is documented for the purposes of your audit, so that when the auditors do want to be asking questions about certainly a transaction or a way that dilapidations claim was handled, for example, you're able to demonstrate that you have, been assessing what needs to be done. So if I move on then next to looking at the role of agents, and I'll just hand over to Rachel, who'll be able to talk about the next few slides with you.
Thanks, Anne. So two of the other professional advisors that we usually get involved with are, in my capacity as a property litigator, building surveyors often, but also Anne and I work together quite a lot on more complicated transactions, and we work often with agents and with building surveyors. So just looking at the example that Anne was giving about the negotiation of heads of terms and a scenario where, for instance, the landlord might do some works for you, we often find that clients are weighing up whether or not they should get an agent involved, and often that can be because they think the property is low value, or they may only want to have a lease for a few years. Sometimes they will get agents on board where they think, well, we need to have a 15-year lease here and it's quite a lot of money, so we'll do it. So it's very specific to the circumstances, and I think in our experience what we find is, irrespective of whether you've only got a short lease or you're just looking to renew it for a few years, or you're looking for a much longer term investment, it usually is worth getting an agent. So these are just a few headline points on what the agents can offer you. I should say, I think different agents are variable in terms of how much value they can add. So you do need a good agent. And I think some clients have involved agents previously haven't been overwhelmingly impressed by their input, so they think, well, we won't do that again, we don't want to spend the money on them, etc. And that does have a bearing on the appetite to involve them. But the real reason why I think it's essential is, if you don't have an agent, you don't know whether the property that you're trying to let should be £20 a square foot or £15 a square foot, because you don't know all of the transactions that are being negotiated in the local market. You don't know what the headline rent is being achieved. Equally, you don't know if, for example, you're looking to take a 10-year lease, at that point in the market, you may be expected to get, say, a 3-year rent free or some other capital contributions. And the other side won't tell you that, so they will just offer you the headline rent. So you might find that you're getting quite a bad deal. And I think also what we find is, when you're looking at searches for the most suitable space for your needs, you won't often know if a more suitable space might exist. Because the agents are very chatty. They all know what each other is doing. They're all in each other's business. They will know, for example, if a tenant is looking to come out of a few floors of a building or looking to take more space. So they'll just have more market knowledge than you might ever have. And you can't do two jobs. So in our experience, it is worth getting an agent as long as you get a good one. So can an agent really save us money? Again, often the conversation that Anne and I have with many clients is, why should we pay an agent? We know the market, we do deals on this all the time. And as I've said on the previous slide, you might do, but often you won't be able to negotiate on the same footing, especially if, for example, the landlord has an agent and you're dealing direct, because you've got day jobs to do. So you don't have the market knowledge, but you also don't have the time to go searching the market and trying to find out what the most appropriate price might be. So we've put one lived example on here, which one of our clients has very kindly allowed us to put up just to highlight the kind of deal that was negotiated by the client direct versus the one that the agent managed to negotiate. So this is actually a property in Harrogate. It's our office building, the Exchange. So it's not that property. But this was a transaction where the client was looking for a long-term lease and had been discussing a 15-year lease at £250,000 per annum with no break rights, and there were no incentives or rent frees offered. A little bit of time later, an agent became involved acting for the client, mainly because a particular client had far too much on their hands and needed to offload this particular exercise. And at that point in time, the agent was looking at a 10-year lease, and the square footage negotiations led to an annual rent of £207,000, so £43,000 less, with a break right, and also 2 years rent free, which was amounting to over £300,000. So when you look at all of that over the term, it was a much better proposal. And the reason for that is, when the landlord was negotiating, they knew within it that they were negotiating with somebody who's doing this, and that's their day job, and they're doing it day in, day out, and they know what the property is worth. And we don't want them taking advantage, because they also know that this isn't your day job and that you're trying to do 100 other things. So I think that's just quite a useful example of the difference that you might achieve when you're weighing up, shall I get an agent on board, or shall I try and do this myself? So how can we avoid these issues? Well, this is another client who has kindly allowed me to use this quote. So problems can be caused by lack of reflection, lease fatigue, project fatigue, and lack of reflection afterwards. So I think sometimes what happens is we run into these scenarios, we realise that we could have done it differently, we could have saved some money, and that isn't always fed back through the relevant teams. So then we see the same things happening again, or a year passes and we think, oh well, we need to move properties again, we'll just put a call into the landlord. And obviously everybody is super busy, so they don't have time to sit and open the file and think, oh, how could we have done things in a different way? Could we have saved money? And I think this is important, because where transactions haven't gone so well, we do find it really useful to have a look at how they might have been done in a different way, and whether that would have saved time or money or legal costs, or whether a better deal might have been achieved. So I think if you do have time to have a bit of reflection afterwards, then that's really helpful. Finally, another quote: it's a positive way to get some great results. It's not a cost, it's a saving. And I think this applies to building surveyors, which I'll touch on a little bit later, and agents. What we see, particularly in relation to building surveyors, in the context of dilapidations, and we're looking obviously at the concept of value for money, is that there is often a reluctance to appoint building surveyors, often on claims which are seen to be reasonably low value, say £100,000 claim. Clients will think, well, we'll have a look internally. The schedule looks all right. We don't think we need all that carpet. We think the carpet could be cleaned. We don't think all the carpet tiles should be replaced, or the ceiling tiles all need replacing. So we'll negotiate it, and we'll negotiate it down to say £50,000. And that's quite a common theme. So often if clients can negotiate claims down by a certain percentage from the starting point, then that's seen as a result. But for us, it's not really a result, because we just don't know what the claims are worth. So if the claim had been worth £10,000, it's not such a good result. And I think in what I do, building surveyors really are essential, because you don't have any other means of assessing what the value of your claim is if you don't have a professional on board to have a look at the lease, have a look at reinstatement notices, where reinstatement notices served, and if they weren't served, they cross a load of things off the schedule, which internally is probably not something that you'd be used to doing. And equally, they're doing this day in, day out. So I think the take home from this is, and this is just something that we see, anecdotally quite a bit, is super important to get building surveyors to look at these dilapidation schedules. And obviously, in the context of doing schemes of works, going into leases, or where you're paying landlords to do works for you, they're essential, but they're also essential at the end of the lease.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm just going to be looking now at the heads of terms stage, because that is obviously it's a key aspect of transactional matter. It tends to be that a solicitor is appointed often when heads of terms are either proposed or actually agreed by the parties. And then I'm often asked just to give a legal opinion on the heads of terms, which I'm more than happy to do. But as we all know with heads of terms, they aren't actually a contractual commitment. They are just a proposal. These are the terms that we would like to agree with you, and we would like to reflect those in the legal documentation. Normally it's in relation to a lease, or it might be the sale of a property. So I've put the question there, who should actually review the proposed heads of terms? Because I've found that often we will be sent heads of terms, and the first question I ask is, have these heads of terms been agreed or not? And generally they're not necessarily agreed, or there's a bit of a caveat there, saying, well, they're kind of agreed, but let us know if you've got any concerns. So from a legal perspective, I'm more than happy to obviously have a look at the heads of terms, and give you that legal input. But equally, there is the commercial side of heads of terms, which as a solicitor, I'm simply not qualified to be able to comment on. And that's where an agent or a surveyor are the ones that would need to be commenting on those heads of terms as well from that aspect. So it's a little bit different in the scenarios like Rachel was mentioning. If you have got agents involved already and they are negotiating heads of terms, it's very helpful, and it's reassuring from my perspective when I look at the heads of terms, because I know that I'm just focusing on the legal aspects, and obviously just keeping an eye on things to make sure that they all seem to be joined up. But I wouldn't know if a deal where you're signing up for a 5-year lease, for example, at a rent of £100,000 a year, but then they want to review the rent at year 4. As a lawyer, I know that that doesn't seem to quite work, but I would bow to a surveyor and want them to give their views on heads of terms as well. So what I've done on the slide is I've tried to just identify the key aspects of heads of terms, where certainly solicitor and a surveyor are able to give you that extra reassurance and knowledge and expertise, in case you think that actually I've got some heads of terms that a landlord has sent me directly, and you think, well, they look okay really from my perspective. So leading on from what Rachel was explaining about having an agent on board who's able to negotiate a deal for you and they know the market. If you don't have an agent involved, it's doubly important, I think, to make sure that you're getting input both from a surveyor who can comment on the commercial terms, so the rent, any incentives such as rent-free periods or a reduced rent. And the solicitor as well can also give you their opinion. We look in particular at the nature of any flexibility that you have in the lease, so the length of the term of a lease and any break rights and whether they are mutual break rights or perhaps just a tenant has a break right. And then we'd also look at dealings, so the ability to assign the lease, for example, or to underlet if you would be happy enough to be underletting. And then the other key area, obviously, for yourselves, as you know, is that phrase that I use about NHS concessions. As a blue chip tenant, certainly I make the point regularly that there are certain concessions that we ought to find in a lease arrangement. And there is a list, I've got a precedent actually, which could be a topic for another time, although I know I've touched on it with various of you in the past. But it's really important, I think, to ensure that when we're looking at value for money, the strength of a trust as a blue chip tenant that is going to be paying the rent, although it usually needs at least 28 days to be able to pay once it's been demanded. It's really important that we get the benefits of that. And that's certainly something that the estate code supports, making sure that we get the best arrangements that we can for you. So the point really of mentioning the heads of terms is to ensure that it's not just one professional that would necessarily be looking at them and giving an opinion. It's normally certainly at least a surveyor as well as a solicitor, unless they've been negotiated by an agent. And then Rachel and I have been dealing with a matter recently where the agent is negotiating heads of terms. We've got a complicated structure and a very difficult landlord. And we've gone through various iterations of the heads of terms, and we're all having to feed in to make sure that it's joined up and it works and that you've got the protections that you need in there. So the next aspect that I wanted to talk about as well is it's particularly relevant when you're looking at leasing property, but where works might need to be carried out to the property. It's normal that you would expect that there would be a degree of fit out works that you might need to carry out. But then in certain circumstances, depending upon the condition and layout of the property, it might be the case that the landlord also needs to do some works too. So in relation to that, there are a few key points to bear in mind to make sure that you are trying to secure value for money. So the first one is identifying and documenting in detail the works themselves that are required. And they might fall into different camps. There might be what I think of as enabling works that the landlord ought to be doing first, probably at the landlord's cost. Perhaps the property is in a bit of disrepair, for example, and you want that to be brought up to standard before you do your own fit out works. And it's really important then that the landlord should be paying for them. So what you need is a detailed specification and set of drawings. And this is where a building surveyor comes into their own, because they have the knowledge and expertise to identify exactly what works need to be carried out, and we want to make sure that they are documented. The other key point to bear in mind is the one I've just touched on about who does the works. And so there might be various reasons why a landlord doesn't want a tenant to do any works, even the tenant's fit out works to the building. But obviously, in your position, certainly when you're providing healthcare services, it's going to be rare, I think, that you're going to find just an average landlord who is familiar with the, well, all the regulations and the requirements that need to be satisfied to do works to the right standards. So that's another point that you need to bear in mind. Um, I've mentioned about contractual commitment because depending upon the nature of the works, there are a couple of ways that we can have a legal framework in place for works to be done. We often refer to an agreement for lease where it's usual that a landlord might be doing works first, or for whatever reason, it might be that it's beneficial if the landlord and the tenant are doing works to have an agreement for lease before you enter into the lease itself and then your works are done. Or it might be the case that actually you're just doing fit out works and it's simplest for the lease to start and also for you to enter into a license for alterations on day one so that you can be doing the fit out works. So it all depends upon the deal in question. But in relation to any situation where you've got the landlord doing works in particular, it's really important that you have suitable protections in place. And so in a well-drafted agreement for lease, you will have a requirement for the landlord to allow you to monitor the progress of the works and inspect them throughout the course of the works. And then when it's getting to the time that the works are practically going to be completed, then that's the time when you ought to be invited to be able to attend the inspection so that you can check to see that you're happy with the works and make representations if you have got any niggles about them. And hopefully they've been niggles and not major concerns, because hopefully during the inspection process, if you had major concerns, you would have raised that already. So it's very important that you've got basically input here from the likes of the solicitor trying to get the legal documentation in place, but you also would want surveyor there, probably as a monitoring surveyor. They would be providing the specification and drawings, potentially with input from other professionals like mechanical and electrical engineer. Architect could be putting together the layouts as well. You might need some planning input too from a planning agent. So you can see that although you might come to us with new instructions and say you'd like to take on a lease of a property, and you know that you need to do some fit out works, but you've also got a bit of a concern because you think the landlord needs to do some works as well, it's really important to appreciate that actually there are various professionals and trying to pull together to make sure that we can get the arrangements in place. So I'm going to try and go on to the next slide now. Reach the edge of the screen. There we go. We've got the dilapidations, which Rachel's going to touch on. I think you've already touched on them a bit before, hadn't you?
Yeah, I think just in the context of what Anne has just said, where you have these more complicated arrangements where at the beginning of the lease the tenant might do some work, the landlord might do some works, you might have a license in place which explains how the works will be done and what the reinstatement obligations might be at the end of the lease. It's even more important then to get dilapidation surveyors in, because when the schedules land, you do need professional advice on what you really do have to take out and what you're able to leave in place. And you need to make sure that the landlord isn't trying to charge you for removing kitchens or fit out works if, for example, the license said that you didn't need to, or that a notice was required by the landlord if it required you to take out those types of original work. So often what we're handing over to the building surveyor is a suite of documents with the landlord's works, the tenant's work, the lease. We'll be asking you if you've had any notices to reinstate. So it can be more difficult than there's the lease and there's the schedule and how much of this do we have to pay. So I think that's where the continued use of a building surveyor can be really helpful. And here is another good quote from one of our clients. There are major upsides to using the right people at the right time. And I think that perfectly explains that in the context of these arrangements where you've got agents or architects or building surveyors, everybody has their part to play, and they've all got different skill sets. So as Anne says, we quite frequently get asked to have a look at heads of terms, and the clients will say, oh, do they look all right to you? And really the most that we can ever say is, oh, well, I don't think that with a 10-year term you should find that you don't have any incentives, but we all must stay in our lane, and that absolutely isn't our lane. So that's where you need to have agents to help you, or you need to have a building surveyor who can explain to you what works you might be best doing. And then at the end of the lease, they can also have a look at the dilapidations liability and how much it might cost at the end to be taking these kinds of things out. So looking forward, they can add a real value. And then when we're drafting things, Anne can make sure that that's reflected in the lease. And we've had some advice up front on where you might make sure that you land it at lease termination with any reinstatement or tenants' works that you'll need to do to yield up.
Thanks, Rachel. So in summary, I've put some top tips to securing value for money, following on from what Rachel and I have been talking about this morning. So the first one is the strength of covenant. I was mentioning earlier about the fact that as NHS trusts, you are regarded in the market as a blue chip tenant. You're a very attractive tenant to have. It's worthwhile making the most of that and trying to secure appropriate incentives, as any agent valuer would let you know. The second point is one that I've put in about informed decision making. It's very easy, I think, to be given some heads of terms proposed by a party. They see you as a blue chip tenant, and I think it can be a very attractive proposition for them. So it's really important that we do step back and scrutinise what's being offered early doors and have a think about whose input we need in relation to that proposal. You've got a really difficult job, certainly working in estates teams in particular you have, because I know that you've got lots of different services and service leads at the trusts who will be coming to you, expecting you simply to make things happen, to get the property arrangements in place for a service, or to ensure that they can continue remaining in the property. And part of this is a bit of a mindset, really, a culture, explaining to the teams that they can't just expect things to happen overnight. There is a due process to follow. For audit purposes, you do need to check the deal from a value for money perspective. And if that means that it takes more time and more people need to be involved in scrutinising the deal and trying to get the best deal possible, then it's important, I think, that teams within the trusts are aware of that. Leading on from that, obviously, as Rachel was saying earlier, it's really important that we get the right advisors. And Rachel mentioned that there are some professionals who perhaps aren't quite so suited to dealing with matters. We've had some bad experiences, and it's that kind of a thing. So when you find a good one, that's when it's really important to, be sticking with them. I think really making sure that you're using the right people to give you the advice. One of the other key takeaways, excuse me, is making sure that you try and appoint those right advisors at the earliest stage. You're getting engagement early doors. So when you are approached by a service lead, for example, who is wanting to relocate to a new property, they perhaps won a contract and they need to be providing services. They'll have a date that they need to start the service from. Um, and then they ask you to help them secure the property. It's really important that we are getting that early engagement with the right professionals, early doors. So if you're trying to source properties, for example, then going to the agents and finding out what is there, because I know with a lot of the services you are having to deliver services from certain localities. Then at least if you ask the agents, then they'll have the knowledge of that. Combined with that, it's making sure that there's that joined up approach. So as Rachel and I have mentioned, we work closely together. We deal with some of the more complex deals. And it's not just lawyers, solicitors trying to work together. We find that we work very closely with surveyors and agents as well. And I think when we are all regarded as a team working together with yourselves, that's the best way that we can achieve the results that you need. And then one of the other key takeaways is looking at that bigger picture, though, because when you talk about value for money, or when I look at the estate code, it's easy, I think, to think, well, we're just looking at what cost savings we can make here. It's only really money that we're talking about, but we appreciate that it's not. You've got your hands tied providing these services. And so we want to try and get the best arrangements we can for you, the best deals. It's not as simple, though, as looking at what the level of the rent is going to be and how long you're signing up for a term, or if you're buying a property, how much that's going to cost. It's looking at that bigger picture, obviously, because you're trying to juggle the expectations and needs of the service as well. And so I think one of the quotes I always think of is many hands make light work. And it is really important that there is that team of people that can be helping you make sure that you can deliver, because you've got very difficult and very busy jobs. And so we're here to help. So that was kind of wrapping it up in summary, but then I just wondered if we've got any particular questions they'd like to raise. David, you've got your hand up, I can see.
Hi everyone, thanks Anna, thanks Rachel. Really interesting, really relevant, so really appreciate that. I just had a couple of observations, if that's all right.
Yeah.
I know you said how strongly kind of the strength of the NHS is in negotiating leases and things, but it seems quite unethical then that we can't directly negotiate a good deal with the landlord. We have to bring an agent in when it's spending public money. It seems a bit frustrating, that, but there you go.
It's not, if I just say, it's not that you have to, because we appreciate that you've got qualifications yourselves, within the teams, the estates teams, you've got qualified people who will, and in past lives even, I know that you might have been negotiating deals. I think it's more a case of, we're not saying that you have to, but it is beneficial at times, and certainly with some of the more complex arrangements that we've had. Certainly deals that we've been dealing with recently, we've found that some landlords are very opportunistic, and you need someone who their day job is simply negotiating terms to be able to go in, and it helps, I think, having one step removed, having an agent that you can direct communications and negotiations through. So it's not that in every single case you need to do that, but it is worthwhile, certainly, considering that, because there are some tricky operators out there who will try and rinse you, for want of a better description. So it's not for every situation, David. We appreciate, with your own expertise, that you would be perfectly capable of trying to negotiate. But the thing with agents is, if you've got a tricky situation, they've got their ears to the ground and they know the market. they all talk to each other. So often it can just help. It can give you that bit of added value by using the agents.
I agree. There is an ethical argument, isn't there? So,
Yeah.
and then I think you can easily fall into using, you see a property, it's a large lease, it's a lot to negotiate, and there's an agent involved kind of with the marketing, and you can soon fall into the position where you're working with that agent, you're waist deep in negotiation, and that agent's acting for the landlord, is always acting for the client as well. And I think it's really important to just, as soon as you can, set out some commercial terms with that agent, so you're not kind of too deep into it before it's too late. I'm not saying there's a problem, but the sooner you can set out the rules of engagement, the better. And I just had a question about we've had a couple of buildings or leases that we've taken on recently where the landlord has done fit out works for us and has been funded through the lease term. But to reach a good position on the documentation, the specification of scope, the landlord's had to commit to detailed design with architects, M&E, QS, etc. And the landlord has paid that out of his own money and then put it back into the lease term. But there's a risk for the landlord there that he's committing to something that might not happen. And I just wouldn't, is there a mechanism just to strengthen that a little bit so that both parties are protected?
Yeah, it's a good point, because ordinarily with an agreement for lease, you would expect the detailed specification and drawings to be attached to it, wouldn't you, really?
Yeah.
I suppose, so the point is that if the landlord's taking, it depends if the landlord's taking all of the risk in that situation or whether the trust is taking some risk as well, because the trust is also having to invest time and money in reviewing the specification and making sure it's correct. But are you thinking more about the professional fees that are going to be incurred?
So, for example, St. Peter's House, which we've recently taken the lease for, the landlord paid for the architect and the M&E design to reach a position where we could sign off those drawings to ensure the specification was correct. Ultimately, the cost of that has gone into the lease, but he was paying that out of his own money before the lease was signed. So it was his risk, but it felt there was a lot of trust involved in that rather than some sort of commercial terms or agreement.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where it boils down to the fact that as a blue chip tenant, the landlord will know that you're going to be good for the rent, you're going to comply with the obligations, you will have the money. Whereas when they've got a private sector tenant, they have that big risk, and they can try and offset that by asking for a guarantor, but they still take the risk. So I think that although it might be perceived that the landlord is taking a big risk, incurring the cost, in the end he's not, because if he gets the trust as tenant, then that's obviously the end game for him, isn't he? And I think that it's looking at the kind of the benefits outweigh the potential risk that he might seem to be taking up front.
Risk and reward, isn't it?
Yeah, it is really. And I think that's where it's important to be firm and with them, because they are at the end of the day getting a really good covenant that they're not going to be worried about. So however long the term of the lease is, that they're not going to be concerned about that. They just want to make sure that they've actually got you on the hook effectively for the life of the term, really. So I'd be minded not to be trying to offer them anything more. I think the fact that you're interested, you're getting committed, I think would be reward enough for them, personally. Yeah. Has anyone got any other questions now? Heather's just put something in the chat. We've run out of time. There we go. I'll just have a look at the chat as well. Well, I think probably then we'd just I suppose wrap it up then, seeing as we've been told that we've run out of time. But it's been really good to see you joining, and if there are any topics for the future that you'd like us to cover on a webinar, then please feel free to either put them in the chat or just email either Rachel or myself separately. Any feedback is gratefully received. So as you can see in the slide there, if you'd like to give us some feedback, that would be really welcome as well. But if no one's got anything else on that note, I would wish you a good day. I hope the weather improves and it's not too busy a day for us either. So thank you very much.